28 years, and I've tried many different ways to stop using. I've been in various detox centres, I've tried street methadone programs, I've tried therapeutic communities, and I never managed to stay clean. You know, I'd never had the support around me of the fellowship, and I'd never heard about the fellowship. And then on my last time in treatment, which was 3 years ago now, H&I came in, and Narcotics Anonymous found me in there, you know, and I got the message. And people that were leaving the treatment centre previously were then people that had been coming back in, and it was very clear to me that people that was part of the fellowship of Narcotics Anonymous were staying clean, and the other people that were leaving the treatment centre that was going out by themselves and doing it, you know, they were falling by the wayside. So, you know, I was just at that point where I just think I'd hit a rock bottom, you know, internally, and I sort of, you know, it talks about in our literature spiritual, physical and emotional, you know, sort of decay, and I just felt that's what was happening. I felt like the light was going out on the candle. It was like, you know, I just had numerous mornings of getting up and sitting on the edge of the settee and just crying and sort of wanting to try and find a way out, and you know, wanting to not use and yet not knowing how not to use, you know, because it had been such a big part of my life, and that's pretty much how I came in touch with Narcotics Anonymous. It's through the message H&I. Yeah, when I was first young, I mean, I think I'd like to start by saying, because this is the funny thing for me, you know, it's sort of like the disease of addiction, you know, as a result of having this disease in my life, that was very present in my life from the age of 6. I remember getting picked last for a relay race in the school playground, and I remember in that moment making a decision about me, you know, and that decision was that I wasn't good enough, and that I was different. And I have a secondary illness where I have a trapped nerve in my brain, and so it's sort of like, you know, the muscles in my legs progressively, you know, becoming more tighter and sort of wasting away. So what happened is that for me is that, you know, I was very obsessive about me and very inward about me from an early age. Now, as a result of that, a lot of things happened, you know, in my life as a youngster where my behaviour would bring attention to me, whether it be negative attention, that didn't matter for me. It was sort of like, it felt like at the time that was my solution to being noticed, you know, because I just think that I felt that, you know, I wanted people to like me. I wanted to be accepted, because who didn't really like me and who didn't accept me was me. And so when I first found my first, the first thing that took me out of being me, a substance, which was glue, you know, from the age of 11, I started doing that at school, and it was very easy in all the substances that I used throughout my life, because what I always got to be was part of something that I didn't need to put that much effort into initially to be part of that. You know, it was going out with the guys at school, and you know, going behind the sheds in the summer, in the holidays, and just taking glue. And then, you know, at the age of 11, I also picked up cannabis. And I was brought up around a family that was very much orientated. It was the 70s at this time, and my family were brought up around all the old festivals. I was brought up with long hair, Afghan coats, sitting around in circles, you know, smoking joints. And I was made aware when one of my friends stayed over, from being the age of 11, that my stepdad had walked into my bedroom with a joint in his hand. You know, so it started for me there. And what happened when I first started doing all that stuff at the beginning, it was like, you know, part of it was actually fun, you know, and then I even questioned the fun in that, because, you know, what's really sad about all this, and what I've got to see as a result of working the program, is that, you know, all my life it was about getting away from me, and that's the sadness in it all. So yes, you know, it might have been fun, but I don't know, I'm not too sure about what's really happy about never wanting to be me. You know, and I went through a progression of drugs, and by time at the age of 15, it was amphetamines, you know, and I think I burnt myself out on that, and as a result of that, I ended up then going into prisons. And when I came out of my first prison sentence, I met heroin. Now, when I met heroin, you know, it was like, how it felt for me is like my mother would come up to me and put her arms around me and said everything's going to be okay. It was like this big hole that I'd had in me, this need for something, you know, need for feeling okay with me came as a result of me using heroin. So that was my solution. It was a solution at the beginning, you know, and then it became the problem because during all them years of using, what happened is I went into jail and out of jail, into treatment centres and out of treatment centres. I spent about 6 years of my life in jail, 4 years of my life in institutions, you know, such as treatment centres, and it just started becoming harder, you know. And before I came into recovery, I believed that I lived in a rock bottom, you know, for about 4 or 5 years, and that was really, really painful. I used to get up in the morning, and me and my girlfriend, you know, we used to do this thing about saving the filters, you know, from like what we used to wash up from heroin. And as soon as I opened my eyes in the morning, you know, that fear and that dread would just come up, and I would start thinking about using. And I would do that from the moment I woke up in the morning until the moment that I either collapsed or went to bed in the evening. And my using just got painful because, you know, like I say, when we got up in the morning and we shared these filters, you know, we would look to try and separate, you know, what she's going to be using and what I'm going to be using, and we would just start arguing over minute amounts that were going to get none of us, if we took all of it and twice or 3 times as much anything out of it, and yet we would do this ritual of arguing every morning about who had the most, whose water looked the darkest, you know, and in my using, I have had amounts where, you know, I can smoke all the way through the day and through the night, you know, but I've also done all that stuff about looking on the carpet for all the little white bits, you know, from the crack pipe, you know, smoking cheese and toenails and sort of like, you know, anything that was white, you know, breadcrumbs, whatever it might be on the carpet. And I would pile it up and I would have this experience all the time, and I would light it and it wasn't crack at all. And yet, and I would still, you know, the next day or maybe in a week's time, do all that stuff again. You know, so it wasn't pretty. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't great. Do you know what I mean? It was just really, really painful. And, you know, that stuff about getting up in the morning and sitting on the settee and crying, as I was mentioning previously, you know, before coming into recovery for a couple of years, I didn't inject because I'd used all the veins in my body. I couldn't get a hit no more. You know, I was onto smoking it. But the times for about the 3 years before them 2 that I talked about living in a rock bottom for 5 years, them 3 years spent trying to get a vein in my body was sat on the settee, sort of like trying to get a hit, and there'd be blood running down my arms, down my legs, and I'd be crying, and it'd be, please God, just this last one, you know. And then what had happened as a result of that is I would get it, and it was never going to be the last one. You know, I'll be back out, and I would be looking to, you know, ways and means to get more money to carry on using. You know, I became isolated from my family. I became isolated from my friends. You know, I didn't have a lot to do with my family really during my using, and the little time that I did, you know, I just brought pain into their life. You know, I wasn't one of them people that really pinched off my family. However, what I took was my mum's peace of mind. You know, and I think that was the biggest thing that I could have stole. And also, you know, friends. There wasn't friends. There was associates in my life. You know, it was like they would be out for using me and I would be out for using them. And this is the thing, you see, because like the thing with the disease of addiction where it took me is that, you know, I used drugs initially and then the drugs started using me. You know, it was like I used my friends, I used the places I visited, I used the people in my life. You know, and that's what my life was about. It was about using, you know, and I always thought that it was always about everybody else. I always thought it was, well, you know, if I didn't live here, it would be differently. If I wasn't hanging around with them, it would be different. If I wasn't in this relationship, it would be different. You know, it was all about blame. I didn't know how to take any responsibility for sort of, you know, what was going on in my life. You know, and from any time that I did a treatment centre or went in jail, you know, if I wasn't using while I was in them places, from the first time I picked up, you know, that cycle would start all over again. You know, I was about 7.5 stone before I came into treatment the last time. And I was yellow. You know, I looked a mess. and I physically looked like I was dying. You know, mentally, you know, the illness had got a hold of me, and I was desperate. You know, and it talks about in our readings being at the end of the road. You know, and I really believe this time I was at the end of the road. You know, I'm not too sure that some of the times in my life I wanted to stop using. I just knew that I didn't want to be in the situation I was in at that time. This time something was different. This time it felt different. You know, I was desperate. And in one of our readings it talks about until in desperation we sought help from each other in Narcotics Anonymous. You know, and I was desperate. I was a desperate addict. You know, at the end of the road, I was dying. My life had stopped. You know, it was that cycle. Get up, use, find ways and means of getting more, use. You know, and the thing was is that the drugs that I was taking, they stopped working. The crack wasn't working no more. The heroin wasn't working no more. You know, I was on vast amounts of methadone and prescription drugs. You know, and I got to the point of using mental health sort of drugs, tablets, amitriptyline, you know, and taking large amounts of them just to be able to knock me out. Because where it got to was unless I was unconscious, I wasn't happy no more. You know, and that was my evening in the end. It wasn't pretty at all. It was a real desperate, long, dark road. You know, and it was crazy because the denial in me was that thick. It's like I lived most of my life, apart from the times I had to go pick up prescriptions or going down the town and make money, you know, or the times that I was selling drugs in my life. I was spending a room with my girlfriend for them last 6 years, and the curtains would be closed, and I would live in darkness, you know, and it was like, and I could still look in the mirror, and the denial in me would still tell me, you're okay, you're doing all right, you know. It's like, you know, that you're still the dog's bollocks, and I just thought, you know, it's like when I look back on that, I think, what was all that about? You know, I could pay 20 or 30 pounds for a pipe and spend my time sitting, looking out the window, looking in the cracks of the curtains, you know, for seeing the drug pod that wasn't even there, you know, or going up to the door and looking out of the letterbox and looking out of the keyhole and spend time running around my house, sort of like, you know, listening for noises, you know, believing actually that I was that important that the police would want to be surrounding my whole house anyway. You know, it was like, it was terrible. It was painful. It was desperate. That's where it took me, Phil, you know. I was originally born in a small place called Scunthorpe, which is in Humberside, and then I lived in Sheffield for a number of years, 20 years. And at the moment I live on Portsmouth, which is as far on the south coast as you can get virtually. It's on the coast, and you look over from where I am and you can see the Isle of Wight, which is a little island over there. You know, I did many geographics, you know, during my using. I lived in various amounts of places, gave up really nice places to go to colleges, believing that would stop me from using. You know, I've lived in, even in the 90s, I had some relief from sort of, from the drastic using that I had, and I ended up going to Peru to work with street children, you know, because it's sort of like the thing was, I didn't know about the disease of addiction, and when you used to be in treatment centres, therapeutic communities, back in the day, they used to do this thing where when you got to a certain point, they do this manageable drinking, you know, where it's just a joke really, but you know, I wasn't aware at the time, and maybe some people can do that, and I don't want to, you know, it isn't a judgment on others, I just know it didn't work for me, you know, not just in the UK, and until I came into Narcotics Anonymous and its message was carried to me, I've never felt freedom as I know today. You know, I know freedom isn't about changing where I live, about the girlfriends that I have in my life, about what I have on a material level. You know, all them things are really nice, but I believe they become as a result of me working this program. You know, they don't you know, I know that I can't, nothing. The message from me isn't outside of myself. You know, if I look for the message outside of me, you know, then that for me, that isn't the message. You know, as a result of the little time that I've stayed clean now, you know, all the stuff that is coming in my life is coming as a result of working this program. You know, the friends that I have, the job that I have, the house that I have today, you know, is all a result of being in this program. And I believe that, you know, because I'm so lucky and privileged to have been through the experience that I went through, because, you know, I'm not moaning about any of the stuff that's happened to me in my life previously. You know, I'm not a victim, and I know that today. You know, in my life, I became a willing victim. From the moment I made the decision about me, I became a willing victim. I put myself in the situations that I put myself in. You know, I ended up having to live in many places. I ended up having to be in many institutions. I ended up having to go to many jails as a result of the decisions that I made in my life. You know, about me and about the adults in the world. You know, and I was down. You know, I made a decision when I was 6 years old. I also went through various amounts of abuse in my life, and I remember making this decision that adults couldn't be trusted, you know, and that they wasn't okay and that I wasn't okay. And from the minute I made that decision, you know, what happened as a result of that is that, you know, my life was just momentarily, you know, going to be directed basically in the direction that it went, you know, and you know, and the thing is for me about this, you know, is that, you know, people say around the room that drugs aren't the problem, I am the problem, and now I hear that, you know, and I understand that. However, you know, if I wasn't ever in danger of using drugs again, then I wouldn't need to be in this program. You know, I come to this program because, you know, I continually want to carry on working on myself and looking at myself and, you know, gaining the spirituality I have in my life today, the God of my understanding in my life today, the people in my life today, you know. But I need to do that, because if I don't do that, what will happen as a result of that is I'll go and use, because that's what, that even though all the experience of the years before told me that using doesn't work, what happens is when that disease gets a hold of me is what I go back to, is what I know. And all the stuff that I learn, you know, in Narcotics Anonymous, you know, once that disease is very active and I choose to put that program down, I will use. So it is about drugs on some level. You know, it's got to be about using, because that's why I came to Narcotics Anonymous, because what I did was use drugs, you know. And I don't have to today. I don't have to use today. You know, I have to do a few simple things, you know, and I hear this from the times that I came into the rooms, you know, people said, get yourself a sponsor, you know, come to meetings, open your mouth when you need to, do service, you know, give back to the newcomer, you know, and that's what I've done, you know, ever since coming in. That's what I continue to do. And as a result of that, I've never had to go and use, you know, ever since coming back into Narcotics Anonymous. You know, I know some people might go out there and relapse, you know, that's not my story though. I've not had to relapse. You know, I've had to do these few simple things, sponsorship steps and service, and I've done that, and it's never failed me, you know. And I love what I have today, you know. Do you know, all my life, I was always trying to be somebody else. I always wanted to be somebody else. You know, today, I go into the program of NA, and this didn't happen straight away, but today I can be me. You know, I never could be me before, because I never believed that I was good enough. But today I'm starting to believe that. I don't love myself, but I have a relationship with myself today. You know? I have people in my life today. You know, Richard's okay. You know? I'm okay with all my defects and with all the things that I brought into the rooms of Narcotics Anonymous. You know, I've had an opportunity to clear some of the wreckage of my past. You know, I've had an opportunity and been given an awareness through working the steps of our program to know who Richard truly is. You know, I wrote a step 4, and what I got from that step 4 is I got to see Richard, you know, and I needed to be able to do that. You know, the 1, 2, 3, the 1 told me what it is that I have. I have the disease of addiction. It told me that, you know, I was powerless. It showed me that, you know, my life was unmanageable. You know, but then I become to believe in a power greater, and I got took into the solution. You know, a lot of people say that step 2 is about insanity. Well, the first part of it is about insanity. You know, and the basic text tells us that insanity is repeating the same things and expecting different results. And I get that. But, you know, for me, it's part of the solution, because it says, you know, we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves would restore us to sanity. So that means we're looking at being restored, you know, and the power greater. And then I go into step 3 and I start being in the solution. And for me, that, you know, I start getting some direction. I make a decision to turn my will and my life over, you know, and I have to start looking at what is my will, You know, and my will and all the stuff I see, I start seeing that in a step forward, because 1, 2, and 3 are great, and they're the foundation. But if I can't see myself coming, then, you know, this disease will come back round and bite me on the ass, and that's what it did many a times. That's what it did when I tried to be doing it how Richard thought he needed to be doing it, you know. So what I'm saying is, I've got to see myself coming, and out of that, you know, I've got to be able to share that stuff with another person and let go of a lot of secrets, you know, and I've got to be able to accept me on a deeper level when my sponsor then shared with me, you know, and related to me and told me his experience.